There's often a difference between the cultural wisdom that gets passed down from us, from generation to generation of civilization. Often a difference between that cultural wisdom and divine wisdom, what is called by some the wisdom from above. This morning's passage from the Wisdom of Solomon reminds us that quite often that difference is the difference between life and death. And as we move to the epistle from James, James breaks down that difference between the wisdom that leads to life and the wisdom that leads to death. He breaks it down in some detail. In fact, I think if James were writing his epistle today and had access to some good graphics, we would probably see something like a table or a chart. And on one side it would be the wisdom that leads to life and all the characteristics by which we can discern whether we are acting and behaving with that wisdom or not. And on the other side, the wisdom that leads to death, with all the characteristics of our behaviors that might want to clue us in that the wisdom we're following is the wisdom that will lead to death. Maybe not physical death, maybe it's spiritual death. Maybe not individual death, maybe it's the death of a community or the values of a people. But there are wisdoms in the world which we think of as sacred wisdom, as divine wisdom, that we can trust to lead us to life. And there are also wisdom in the world, there are also wisdoms in the world passed down, sometimes that help a certain society or civilization or person get ahead, and can be trusted to do that for the short term, but eventually lead to death. Some of the things James says about the wisdom that leads to life is we can tell that that's the wisdom that we are paying attention to when the things we do are being done with gentleness. That's a sure sign, he says, that we're following the wisdom that leads to life. We can tell that we're following the wisdom that leads to life when we're willing to yield to someone else, even when we think we're right. When we catch ourselves doing that, we can pretty well bet we're following the wisdom that leads to life. We can tell, he said, that we're following the wisdom that leads to life when the fruit of our behavior, the fruit of the works we do, the things we say, the attitudes we have, when the fruit of that is mercy. When the fruit of that shows no hypocrisy about only mercy for some and not mercy for all. And he says that we can tell when we're following the wisdom that leads to life. When everything we do arises from that place of peace. Peace meaning not some warm, still feeling that we like, but the peace of shalom, Hebrew word, or salam, Arabic word. That peace that speaks to a wholeness and a connection and harmony in that wholeness that leads to the well-being of all. When those things are present, or even one, we can kind of tell we're on the track of letting the wisdom that leads life lead us. Likewise, he gives us some hallmarks to maybe be flags, to call our attention to the fact that the wisdom we are following may not be the wisdom that leads to life, that it might be the wisdom that leads to death. He says if we catch ourselves acting out of bitterness, or feeling an extreme bitterness, we might want to take a second look, because perhaps the wisdom we're using is a wisdom that will lead to death. He says when we catch ourselves acting in ways that are boastful because we're so sure we're right, we know it, and we act in ways that are boastful, sometimes bending the truth a little bit to make our point better, because it's a good point. It just needs a little more than the truth is able to supply. When we catch ourselves doing that, James says we might want to realize that we've sort of stepped out of the flow of the wisdom that leads to life and had at least one foot in the flow of a wisdom that will lead us to death. Maybe not our own, but maybe the death of a vision, a dream, or the well-being of all. He says, when we catch ourselves in situations where we seem to be driven by envy and are reacting out of envy, and everything we do is ending up in chaos and disorder, and we are falling into and instigating even conflicts and disputes, that when that just keeps happening, we may want to take a second look. It might not just be that the truth is bumped up against something else. It might be that we're operating out of a wisdom that will lead us all to death. And he says that when we catch ourselves with a goal that is so important to us that we're willing to use any means possible, no matter how damaging that means may be, and no matter how much those actions will have an impact on the whole, when we think that that end is so righteous that it justifies that kind of means, we might want to look at which flow of wisdom we're flowing with. Now, it's clear from the epistle which side of that chart we would like to be on. I don't think any of us say, hey, sign me up for the side of wisdom that leads to death. I think most of us would readily say, yeah, I want to be on that side of wisdom that leads to life. But as Jesus makes clear in the Gospel of Mark, following this wisdom that leads to life, this wisdom from above, this sacred wisdom, this divine wisdom, following that kind of wisdom can very easily look like failure in the eyes of the world. It can look like death before it gets to the point of looking like resurrection. What looks to be last in the eyes of culture is quite often really what comes first, and the divine wisdom that we see in the way God has gone about ordering the whole universe. In fact, when we look closely at the universe and the natural order of God's creation, we get a good glimpse of this kind of counterintuitive wisdom which typifies divine wisdom, typifies the wisdom that leads to life. For example, according to most cultural wisdom that's passed on to us through generations of civilization, we tend to think that bigger is better. Just go to McDonald's. But if we actually take a look at the world of nature, we can easily see that needing to be big in the world of nature in order to make a difference is not always the case. As one old African proverb points out, if you think you're too small to make a difference, you have not spent a night with a mosquito. In the divine wisdom of the universe, there are times when we need to act small rather than big in order to make a difference. Or another example, according to most cultural wisdom, it is more important to spend time doing things that will solve problems rather than taking time to tend to matters of the heart. We are a problem-solving culture. Tell me a problem, I won't even stop to think twice. I'll start figuring out how to fix it. But as an old Chinese proverb points out, a bird does not sing because it has an answer. A bird sings because it has a song. In the divine wisdom of the universe, the song our heart sings may need to be recognized before the solutions to our problems can evolve. Or for a third example, according to most cultural wisdom, it is best to hold on to the things in life with which we are familiar. Yet, as the 6th century philosopher Heraclitus points out, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. In the divine wisdom of the universe, change is not the enemy. Change is the way God moves us from bondage to wilderness to the promised land. This means that quite often, when we're trying to discern the wisdom that will lead to life from the wisdom that leads to death, it will not always be easy to distinguish which is which. Because following the wisdom that leads to life may first appear to run counter to everything our common sense tells us to do. A story illustrating this point comes to mind, and I don't know who wrote it. I don't know where it comes from. But it goes like something like this. There was a wise woman. She was traveling in the mountains when she came across a stream. She went to the stream, and it was a clear stream. She was looking at the bottom of the stream, and she saw a stone that looked to be like it might be a very precious stone, not just a river rock. And so she picked up the stone, and she put it in her bag that she was carrying over her shoulder. The next day, she came along another traveler on the road. The traveler was hungry. He had not packed enough food, and he asked her for some food. So she opens her bag in order to get the food out, and while she's getting the food out, and he's looking, he notices the precious stone in the bag. And so he says, he said, what I'd really like is not so much the food, I'd like that stone that you've got in your bag. Could I have that? Now, cultural wisdom and common sense would say to the woman, you offered him the food, you found the stone, keep it. There's no reason to give it away. But the woman, she did not keep the stone. She gave it to her fellow traveler without a moment's hesitation. The traveler left rejoicing in his good fortune because he knew that that stone was worth enough to give him security for a lifetime. And let me point out here that nothing in this story says this was a poor man to begin with. He just was a man that hadn't packed enough food for his journey, as far as we know. Okay? So he leaves, and he's so happy, and some days start going by, and he gets less happy. He's still got that stone. And he finds that the longer he keeps that stone, the less happy he feels. And so he turns around, and he goes back in search of the woman. It wasn't too easy to find her, but finally he did. And when he found her, he said, I've been thinking, I know how valuable this stone is, but I'm going to give it back because I hope that you can give me something else that's even more precious. And then when a woman asked him, what do you desire? And without a moment's hesitation, the man said, I desire what you have within you that enabled you to give me the stone. And the wise woman said, you have already found it. You see, divine wisdom lives within each of us. It's not something that you've got to go out looking for someplace else. It lives within each of us. And we can recognize it. We can recognize it when we see it, or hear it, or experience it. There's something inside of us that says, oh, I know that's really true. It is the wisdom which enables us to hold lightly those things that are precious to us, so that we can be willing to give them away when the time is right. It is the wisdom that enables us to move with the river's flow and to sing the song of our heart's best dream. It is the wisdom born of peace, shalom, salam. The wisdom in which each life makes a difference, whether that life is lived big or small. whether that person is considered first or last, whether even you are considered first or last. In our own lives, may the Spirit teach us to recognize this wisdom that leads to life. And when we recognize it, may we choose it. Amen.
Amen.